In September 1260, a slave army did what no kingdom had done in 40 years. They lured the undefeated Mongol Empire into a trap, killed their general, and stopped an invasion that had crushed every power from China to Hungary. The battle lasted 6 hours. The consequences lasted forever. February 1258. Baghdad burned for 7 days straight. The Tigris River ran black with ink from destroyed libraries, then red with blood from 200,000 corpses. Mongol cavalry under Hulagu Khan trampled the Abbasid Caliphate into dust and ash. The city that had been Islam's beating heart for 500 years became a graveyard where even the stones screamed. Hulagu's horsemen moved like a plague through Persia, Iraq, and Syria. Cities that resisted were erased. Cities that surrendered were enslaved. By 1259, Aleppo was rubble, and Damascus had opened its gates in terror. The Islamic world had no center left, no army capable of resistance. Only Egypt remained, ruled by warriors who had once been property. Before we dive into 6 hours that changed history forever, smash that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss how empires fall, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's watch the Mongols learn what happens when slaves remember how to kill. The Mamluks were not born to power. They were purchased as boys from Central Asian slave markets, Kipchaks and Turks, torn from their families and shipped to Cairo in chains. Egyptian sultans bought them as investments in violence. They were trained until their muscles knew only the weight of swords and their eyes tracked movement like hunting cats. They learned to shoot composite bows from galloping horses, to fight in formations that moved like single organisms. In 1250, these slave soldiers looked at their masters and made a calculation. They murdered the Sultan and seized Egypt for themselves. By 1260, Sultan Qutuz ruled from a throne built on dead masters. His army knew hunger, knew chains, knew exactly how empires died. Spring 1260. Hulagu Khan sent emissaries to Cairo with a letter written in the blood-simple language of conquest. Surrender Egypt or watch it burn like Baghdad. Sultan Qutuz read the demand in his throne room while his Mamluk commanders watched in silence. The room smelled of incense and old fear. Qutuz ordered the envoys dragged to Bab Zuwayla, Cairo's southern gate, where executioners worked with efficient brutality. The heads were mounted on spikes, mouths frozen in final screams, eyes pecked by ravens. It was a message carved in bone and sinew: Egypt would not kneel. The Mongol war machine, undefeated from the Pacific to Poland, turned its full attention south. Collision was now inevitable. August 1259. News arrived from distant Karakoram that shattered Mongol momentum. Mongol Khan, the great Khan who ruled from Mongolia, had died of dysentery during the siege of a Chinese city. Mongol law was absolute and ancient. All princes of the blood must return to elect the new Khan. Hulagu Khan, standing in Syria with perhaps 100,000 warriors, faced an impossible choice. Stay and conquer Egypt, or return east and lose the succession to rivals. He chose blood over empire. By early 1260, Hulagu rode east with most of his army, leaving General Kitbuqa, a Nestorian Christian Turk, with perhaps 12,000 men to hold Syria. The unstoppable horde had blinked. In Cairo, Qutuz saw the opening. July 26, 1260. Qutuz's army left Cairo heading north. 10,000 Mamluk cavalry formed the corps, men who had trained together for decades, who spoke in the silent language of veteran killers. Syrian refugees who had fled Mongol blades joined them. Bedouin tribes seeking vengeance rode alongside. Turkmen warriors, Kurdish fighters, remnants of shattered Ayyubid armies, all gravitated toward the only Muslim force still moving toward the enemy instead of away. They marched up the Mediterranean coast through Crusader territory. The Christians, caught between two apocalypses, chose neutrality and survival. They let the Muslims pass unmolested, even allowed them to camp and resupply outside Acre. Qutuz turned his army inland toward the Jezreel Valley. Kitbuqa was gathering his scattered forces. The world was about to discover what happened when someone fought Mongols using Mongol tactics. Kitbuqa had spent 40 years conquering. He had ridden with the great campaigns through China, Persia, and now Syria. His warriors were veterans who measured battlefields in corpses and calculated victory like merchants counted coin. When spies reported the Mamluk army's size, perhaps 20,000 men, Kitbuqa saw numbers, not threat. His 12,000 included Mongol heavy cavalry, Georgian Christians, Armenian auxiliaries, and Syrian levies whose loyalty was purchased with fear. He had never lost a battle. The Mamluks were former slaves playing at empire. Kitbuqa ordered his forces to concentrate near Ain Jalut, a spring at the foot of Mount Gilboa, where water pooled in the Jezreel Valley. He arrived first and claimed the high ground. It was tactically sound. It was also exactly what Baybars wanted. The Jezreel Valley stretched like a killing floor between mountain ridges. To the south rose Mount Gilboa, its slopes covered with scrub and scattered trees. To the north, the hills of Lower Galilee created natural corridors that funneled movement. The spring called Ain Jalut, Goliath's spring, bubbled from limestone caves, feeding a stream through narrow passes. The valley floor was hard-packed earth in September, the summer heat having baked moisture from the ground. Dust rose easily. Visibility was excellent for mounted archers, but the hills held secrets. Ravines deep enough to hide cavalry, tree cover thick enough to mask movement, terrain broken enough that encirclement was possible. Baybars had fled through this region years earlier as a fugitive. He knew every fold in the earth, every shadow that could hide an army. September 3rd, 1260. Dawn broke red over the valley. Baybars led the Mamluk vanguard, perhaps 1,000 cavalry, into view of Kitbuqa's camp. They rode in loose formation, banners visible, making no attempt at concealment. Behind them, hidden in the ravines and tree-covered slopes of Mount Gilboa, Qutuz positioned the main Mamluk force in complete silence. Horses were kept calm with practiced hands over muzzles. Armor was wrapped in cloth to prevent metallic sounds. 10,000 men became invisible, swallowed by terrain they had studied the night before. Baybars's cavalry rode back and forth across the valley floor for hours, deliberately provocative, a performance designed to trigger Mongol aggression. Kitbuqa watched from his position and saw exactly what he expected to see, an inferior force making fatal mistakes. Mid-morning. Kitbuqa ordered the attack. Mongol light cavalry poured down from their positions like water finding level ground. They rode in the classic step formation, waves of horse archers that would strike, wheel, and strike again. Composite bows sang. Arrows darkened the sky in calculated volleys. The Mamluk vanguard raised shields and absorbed the first impact. Men fell from saddles, horses screamed, but Baybars held formation. This was the crucial moment. Lesser armies would have charged forward in rage or retreated in panic. The Mamluks did neither. They fought with cold discipline, trading arrows, giving ground slowly, bleeding but not breaking. Kitbuqa saw resistance but not organization. He saw casualties but not collapse. He ordered the heavy cavalry forward to finish them. The trap was working perfectly. The Mamluk vanguard suddenly broke. It happened with theatrical precision. Shields dropped, formations scattered, cavalry wheeling their horses in apparent panic. They fled back up the valley toward the hills, a disorganized mass of defeated warriors racing for survival. Mongol horns blew the pursuit. This was how steppe warfare worked. Hit the enemy until cohesion cracked, then hunt the fragments. Kitbuqa's cavalry surged forward in a disciplined chase, maintaining formation even in victory. They had done this 1,000 times across a continent. The fleeing Mamluks led them directly into the narrow approaches between Mount Gilboa's slopes. The valley funneled tighter. Trees closed in on both flanks. The Mongols were so focused on the prey ahead, they forgot to watch the shadows beside them. The trap sprung with mechanical brutality. From the slopes of Mount Gilboa, 10,000 Mamluk cavalry erupted from concealment and crashed into the Mongol flanks. The impact was total. Horses collided at full gallop. Lances punched through leather armor. Swords found necks and faces. The Mongols, strung out in pursuit formation, had no room to maneuver in the narrow valley floor. Mamluk heavy cavalry, men on Arabian horses that outweighed Mongol ponies, drove wedges into the Mongol lines. Arrows came from 3 directions simultaneously. The mathematical perfection of Mongol tactics dissolved into chaos. Warriors who had conquered from China to Syria suddenly found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, fighting an enemy that moved like they moved and struck like they struck. Kitbuqa realized the truth too late. He was fighting Mongols who spoke Arabic. The Mamluks unleashed a sustained arrow barrage that turned the sky black. Mamluk archers had trained their entire lives for this, shooting from horseback at full gallop, loosing arrows in coordinated volleys, maintaining supply through boys who ran forward with fresh quivers. Each archer carried 60 arrows. Supply horses held hundreds more. The mathematics of death unfolded with industrial efficiency. 12,000 arrows per minute fell on Mongol positions. The sound was like hail on stone, like wind through a forest of iron branches. Mongol cavalry tried to return fire, but they were compressed, disorganized, shooting uphill into enemies who appeared and vanished in the dust and smoke. Horses collapsed with arrows bristling from their flanks. Men died with shafts through their faces before they understood the battle had turned. The Mongol center held through sheer veteran discipline. Kitbuqa rallied his warriors with screamed orders and personal example. He was 60 years old, had served 3 great khans, and refused to die running. His heavy cavalry formed a defensive circle, shields raised, lances outward. They traded ground for time, killing Mamluks with every inch surrendered. Mongol arrows still found targets. Georgian auxiliaries fought with religious fury, seeing this as their own apocalypse. But the mathematics were brutal and inevitable. For every Mamluk who fell, the Mongols lost 3. Their formation contracted. The circle tightened. Warriors stepped over the bodies of men they had known for decades. Kitbuqa fought in the front rank, sword red to the hilt, knowing this was how his story ended. The Syrian auxiliaries, levies who had joined Kitbuqa out of fear, not loyalty, saw the collapsing Mongol lines and made calculations of survival. They were Muslim soldiers fighting for a Buddhist-Christian army against fellow Muslims who were clearly winning. The decision took seconds. Syrian cavalry wheeled their horses mid-battle and rode toward Mamluk lines with weapons raised in surrender. Some even turned their blades on the Mongols beside them. Kitbuqa had kept them in reserve precisely because he feared this, but desperation had forced them forward. The betrayal cascaded through Mongol morale like poison. If their allies defected, how could they trust their flanks? The circle contracted further. The end was now a question of hours, not outcome. Despite the ambush, despite the arrows, the Mongols nearly won. Their counterattack hit the Mamluk left wing with such concentrated violence that the entire flank collapsed. Mongol heavy cavalry, armored warriors on horses bred for war, punched through Mamluk lines and scattered them into fleeing fragments. For a moment the battle hung on a knife edge. If the Mongols could break through completely, they could escape the trap and regroup. Mamluk warriors fled toward the rear, spreading panic, shouting that the Mongols were invincible after all. The center began to waver. Qutuz, watching from his command position, saw his carefully orchestrated ambush unraveling. He made a decision that would be remembered for centuries. He removed his helmet so every man could see his face and rode directly into the collapsing wing. "Wise Lama!" Qutuz's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Oh, for Islam!" He galloped into the faltering lines without guards, without caution, his face exposed and recognizable. His personal cavalry followed, elite Mamluks who had sworn oaths written in shared blood. They crashed into the Mongol breakthrough with suicidal courage. Qutuz fought in the front rank, sword rising and falling, his presence a rallying point that reversed psychology. Mamluk warriors saw their sultan, a man who could have commanded from safety, choosing to die beside them if necessary. The left wing stabilized. Fleeing cavalry turned back. The collapse became a counterattack. Sometimes battles turn on tactics. Sometimes they turn on one man's willingness to embody everything his army was fighting for. The Mamluks deployed a weapon the Mongols had never encountered, handheld fire tubes called midfay. These were primitive gunpowder devices, metal cylinders filled with explosive powder and projectiles ignited by flame. They were inaccurate. They were slow to reload, but the sound was apocalyptic and the smoke was thick enough to blind. Mamluk soldiers fired them into packed Mongol positions. The explosions were small, but the psychological effect was total. Mongol horses, bred for war but not for thunder, panicked. They reared and threw riders. They trampled their own warriors in blind terror. The smoke mixed with dust and arrow shadows to create a fog of war, where visibility dropped to arm's length. The Mongols, who relied on coordinated cavalry movements, lost all ability to maintain formation. They were fighting blind against an enemy who knew exactly where they were. By midday, the Mongol position had contracted to a desperate circle, perhaps 200 yards across. They were surrounded on all sides, fighting in every direction simultaneously, standing on ground slick with the blood of their own dead. Mamluk cavalry rotated fresh units into the battle while pulling exhausted warriors back to rest and rearm. The Mongols had no reserves, no rest, no resupply. Their arrows were running out. Their horses were dying under them. Warriors fought on foot, using dead horses as barricades, killing Mamluks with knives and broken lances. This was the final mathematics of annihilation. Attrition without hope, courage without consequence, death measured in hours rather than moments. Kitbuqa remained in the center, visible to every Mongol who still stood, showing them how to die with honor intact. Kitbuqa's horse collapsed with arrows in its chest and neck. The general went down hard, but rose immediately, fighting on foot with sword, and captured Mamluk lance. His bodyguards formed a final ring around him, shields locked, killing with mechanical efficiency even as they died one by one. A Mamluk cavalry charge broke through. Blades flashed. Blood sprayed. The circle collapsed. Kitbuqa was dragged down under weight of numbers, bleeding from a dozen wounds. He was hauled before Qutuz, hands bound, armor stripped, kneeling in the dirt. The Mamluk Sultan looked at this man who had burned cities and enslaved populations. Kitbuqa spat blood and spoke his final words. "When news of my death reaches Hulegu Khan, the ocean of his wrath will boil over." Qutuz nodded to the executioner. The blade fell. The Mongol Empire had lost its first general in 40 years. With Kitbuqa dead, Mongol morale shattered like glass. The disciplined circle became a mob of terrified warriors, fighting for individual survival rather than collective victory. Some tried to surrender. The Mamluks, remembering Baghdad and Aleppo and Damascus, gave no quarter. The slaughter became mechanical. Mongol cavalry broke and fled toward Baisan, 8 miles to the southeast. Mamluk horsemen pursued with methodical fury, running down stragglers, killing the wounded, hunting through the scrub brush and ravines for anyone who tried to hide. The valley floor became a carpet of bodies, men and horses twisted together, arrows protruding like metal grass, the ground churned to bloody mud. The pursuit lasted until sunset. By the time darkness made further killing impossible, the Mongol army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Several hundred Mongols reached Baisan and made a final stand near the town walls. They formed a defensive line with their backs to stone, determined to sell their lives expensively. Mamluk cavalry surrounded the position, but didn't immediately attack. They had been fighting for 8 hours. Men and horses were exhausted. Qutuz ordered fresh units forward. The assault came at dusk, a concentrated cavalry charge that hit the Mongol line like a hammer on cracked glass. The Mongols fought with the fury of men who knew death was certain. They killed scores of Mamluks, but mathematics and exhaustion were absolute. Within an hour the line collapsed. The last Mongols died in the gathering darkness, their bodies piled against Baisan's walls. A few scattered survivors fled east toward the Euphrates. Perhaps 50 Mongols from an army of 12,000 lived to report the catastrophe. Night fell on Ain Jalut. The battlefield was quiet except for the screams of wounded horses and dying men. Mamluk soldiers moved through the carnage with torches, finishing the wounded, looting the dead, collecting arrows for reuse. The stench was already unbearable, blood and voided bowels and horses beginning to bloat in the September heat. The spring that gave the valley its name ran red. Bodies floated in the water. The Mamluks had lost perhaps half their force, 10,000 men dead or wounded. But the Mongols had been annihilated, not defeated, not routed, annihilated. The army that had conquered from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea had been erased in a single afternoon. History had pivoted on 6 hours of violence in an obscure valley. Kitbuqa's severed head was mounted on a spear and carried at the front of the Mamluk army as it marched south. His face was preserved with salt, eyes still open, mouth frozen in final defiance. It was propaganda and proof combined, visual confirmation that the invincible had bled and died like any other man. When the army reached Damascus 5 days later, the population erupted in celebration. The Mongol occupation collapsed overnight. Collaborators were dragged from their homes and torn apart by mobs. Mongol administrators fled east across the Euphrates. Within a month, Aleppo had also fallen back under Mamluk control. The conquest of Syria reversed in weeks. Qutuz sent messengers to every Muslim city with the same message: the Mongols could be beaten. The age of terror was ending. News of Ain Jalut reached Hulagu Khan in Tabriz in late September. He reportedly tore his clothes and beat his advisors. He immediately ordered the execution of the Ayyubid prince an-Nasir Yusuf and his brother, captives he had kept alive as potential puppet rulers of Syria. They were strangled and their bodies thrown to dogs. Hulagu assembled an army of 6,000 and sent them west in December 1260 to reclaim Syria and punish the Mamluks. They met Mamluk forces at Homs and were decisively defeated. Hulagu never personally returned to Syria. The succession struggle in Mongolia demanded his attention. The Ilkhanate's border stabilized at the Tigris River. For the first time in Mongol history, a conquest was not avenged. Ain Jalut became the permanent high watermark of Mongol expansion westward. The Crusader states, watching from their coastal fortresses, realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had remained neutral, hoping the Mongols and Muslims would destroy each other. Instead, the Muslims had won decisively and now controlled Syria completely. The Crusaders had lost their potential Mongol allies and empowered their traditional enemy. Baybars, who would soon seize power, remembered which Christian states had aided Mongol invasions and which had simply watched. Within a decade, he would systematically dismantle the Crusader kingdoms, capturing Antioch, Jaffa, and Caesarea, slaughtering populations with methodical efficiency. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land, which had lasted nearly 200 years, entered its terminal phase. Ain Jalut didn't just stop the Mongols. It determined who would rule the Middle East for the next 3 centuries. Military analysts studying Ain Jalut identified the specific tactical elements that made Mongol defeat possible. First, the Mamluks used Mongol tactics against Mongols: the feigned retreat, the ambush, the coordinated cavalry attacks. Second, they chose terrain that negated Mongol advantages: narrow valleys where encirclement was possible and mobility was restricted. Third, they maintained discipline under pressure, something few medieval armies could achieve. Fourth, they had leaders who understood that beating Mongols required thinking like Mongols. Baybars had designed a trap using the enemy's own psychology as bait. Qutuz had provided the charismatic leadership that held the army together when tactics alone would have failed. Together, they proved that invincibility was always temporary and that any military system could be decoded. Studied and defeated by enemies willing to learn. Across the Islamic world, news of Ain Jalut produced euphoria that bordered on religious ecstasy. For 2 years, Muslims had watched the Mongols burn through civilization like divine punishment. Every army sent against them had been annihilated. Every city that resisted had become a tomb. The psychological weight was crushing. How do you fight enemies that even Allah seemed powerless to stop? Ain Jalut shattered that despair. Mamluks were former slaves, the lowest rung of society, and they had killed a Mongol general and destroyed a Mongol army in open battle. If slaves could do it, anyone could. The myth of Mongol invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of terror, died in the Jezreel Valley. Future enemies would study the battle, learn the lessons, and approach Mongol warfare with hope rather than fatalism. The Mamluk army marched back toward Egypt in triumph. Qutuz had saved Islam, reconquered Syria, and broken the Mongols. He was the greatest hero the Muslim world had seen since Saladin. Baybars, who had designed the trap at Ain Jalut and led the vanguard that baited the Mongols, expected reward. Perhaps governorship of Aleppo, perhaps command of Syrian territories. Qutuz gave him nothing. The Sultan saw ambition in Baybar's eyes and chose to starve it. On October 24, 1260, during a hunting expedition in the Sinai, Baybars and several co-conspirators surrounded Qutuz in an isolated stretch of desert. They claimed later he was hunting hares. Swords came out. The Sultan tried to defend himself, but he was alone, and they were many. He died in the sand, blood soaking into ground he had saved. Power passed to the man who understood that gratitude was weakness. Baybars rode into Cairo and declared himself Sultan before Qutuz's body was cold. There was brief resistance from Mamluks, loyal to the dead Sultan, but Baybars held the loyalty of the veterans who had fought at Ain Jalut. He promised them wealth, power, and continued war against Crusaders and Mongols. The violence of his succession was forgotten in the glory of continued conquest. Baybars would rule for 17 years, a reign defined by military genius, strategic brutality, and administrative efficiency. He rebuilt Egypt's economy, fortified Syria's defenses, and systematically destroyed the remaining Crusader states. He created the Mamluk Sultanate that would dominate the region for 250 years. History remembered him as Al-Malik al-Zahir, the victorious king. It forgot that his throne was built on his commander's corpse. Hulagu Khan died in 1265, 5 years after Ain Jalut, having never avenged the defeat. His successors in the Ilkhanate tried repeatedly to reconquer Syria, invasions in 1281, 1299, and 1303. All failed. The Mamluks had fortified the border, established early warning systems, and maintained a professional standing army designed specifically to counter Mongol tactics. The Euphrates River became a permanent frontier. East of it, the Ilkhanate ruled. West of it, the Mamluks dominated. The Mongol Empire, which at its height controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, never expanded beyond the line where Kitbuqa's head fell in the dirt. Ain Jalut didn't just win a battle. It drew a border in blood that lasted for centuries. Geography itself had been rewritten by 6 hours of violence. Ain Jalut accelerated the Mongol Empire's fragmentation. The defeat convinced many subject peoples that Mongol rule was not inevitable. Rebellions increased across Persia and Iraq. The Ilkhanate turned inward, focusing on controlling existing territories rather than expanding. Meanwhile, the Golden Horde in Russia and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia began fighting each other over succession disputes and territorial claims. The unified empire Genghis Khan had built fractured into warring khanates. By 1300, the Mongols controlled vast territories, but they were no longer a single coordinated force capable of world conquest. Ain Jalut proved that the Mongol system was vulnerable, that terror had limits, that even the greatest military machine in history could be stopped by enemies who refused to accept inevitability. Baybars turned his armies against the Crusader states with systematic ferocity. He had not forgotten which Christian kingdoms had allied with the Mongols during their invasion of Syria. Antioch, which had provided troops to Hulagu's army, was captured in 1268. Baybars ordered every male inhabitant over the age of puberty killed and every woman and child sold into slavery. The city that had been a Crusader jewel for 170 years ceased to exist as a Christian entity. Jaffa fell in 1268, Asaf in 1265, Caesarea in 1265. Castle after castle, city after city, the Crusader presence was methodically erased. By 1291, when Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, finally fell to Mamluk siege, Christian political power in the Holy Land had been completely extinguished. The Crusades, launched with such religious fervor in 1095, ended in total defeat. Ain Jalut had determined which civilization would dominate the region. The Mamluks perfected the military system that had defeated the Mongols. They institutionalized slave-soldier training, buying boys from Central Asian markets, converting them to Islam, and subjecting them to brutal military education that lasted from childhood to adulthood. These warriors had no tribal loyalties, no family connections, no identity except their regiment. They were weapons forged in human shape. The system produced armies of extraordinary discipline and skill. Mamluk cavalry became the most feared fighting force in the medieval world. They defended the Middle East against Crusaders, Mongols, and eventually the Ottoman Turks. The institution would last until 1811, when Muhammad Ali Pasha massacred the last Mamluk leadership in Cairo. For 550 years, slave soldiers ruled Egypt and Syria, proving that military excellence could overcome social origin and that tyranny could be inverted by its own victims. Ain Jalut taught military commanders a truth that would echo through centuries. Invincibility is always temporary, and any tactical system can be defeated by enemies willing to study it. The Mongols had built their empire on speed, deception, and psychological warfare. The feigned retreat, the coordinated ambush, the terror that preceded their armies like a plague. They had never faced an enemy that understood these tactics because they spoke the same language of steppe warfare. The Mamluks were Central Asian warriors trained in the same traditions, familiar with the same horse archery and mobility doctrines. They took Mongol methods and turned them inward with surgical precision. Baybars designed a trap using Mongol psychology as bait. The feigned retreat worked because Kitbuqa expected it to work, on his enemies, not on him. The greatest military innovation is often learning your enemy's playbook and reciting it back with lethal fluency. The Euphrates River became the permanent western boundary of Mongol power. East of it, the Ilkhanate ruled Persia, Iraq, and Anatolia with diminishing effectiveness. West of it, the Mamluk Sultanate controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Islam. Multiple Mongol invasions attempted to reverse Ain Jalut, 1281, 1299, 1303, and all failed against Mamluk defenses designed specifically to counter steppe cavalry. The border held for 60 years until the Ilkhanate collapsed into civil war and fragmentation. No Mongol army ever reached the Mediterranean again. No Mongol Khan ever conquered Egypt. The westward expansion that had begun in Mongolia and swept across Asia ended permanently in a valley named for a giant. Geography had been rewritten by a single September day. The map we know today, with the Middle East under Islamic rather than Mongol control, was determined by 12,000 Mongols meeting an enemy that refused to accept inevitability. The Mamluk Sultanate became the dominant power in the Islamic world for 267 years. Under Baybars and his successors, Cairo transformed into the cultural, economic, and military center of Muslim civilization. Mamluk architects built mosques and madrasas that still stand today. Mamluk merchants controlled trade routes between Asia and Europe. Mamluk armies defeated every external threat: Crusaders, Mongols, and eventually early Ottoman incursions. The system's greatest irony was its foundation, an empire built entirely on slavery that became Islam's greatest defender. Boys purchased in Central Asian markets became sultans who ruled from Cairo's citadel. Property became power. Chains became crowns. The Mamluks proved that military excellence and brutal training could overcome every disadvantage of birth. They saved Islamic civilization not despite being slaves, but because slavery had stripped away everything except the capacity for disciplined violence. It was empire as inverted tyranny. September 3rd, 1260, marked the beginning of the Mongol Empire's long fragmentation. Ain Jalut shattered the myth that Mongol armies were instruments of divine will, unstoppable forces of nature that civilizations could only endure or submit to. Once the myth died, resistance became possible. Subject peoples across the Ilkhanate began rebelling with increased frequency. The Golden Horde in Russia and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia turned their armies against each other instead of outward conquest. The Yuan dynasty in China faced continuous insurgency. By 1300, the unified empire Genghis Khan had forged existed only in memory and propaganda. The age of Mongol supremacy lasted exactly 40 years, from the conquest of Khwarezm in 1220 to the defeat at Ain Jalut in 1260. It ended because slave soldiers standing in a Palestinian valley proved that invincibility was always a lie, and tyranny always taught its victims exactly how to kill tyrants. The Mongols conquered, from the Pacific to Poland, built the largest contiguous empire in human history, and seemed destined to rule the world. They stopped at a spring in Palestine, where former slaves proved that destiny is written by whoever refuses to surrender. Kitbuqa's head rotted on a spear. The Euphrates became a border. And the age of Mongol invincibility ended not with a whimper, but with 12,000 corpses teaching the world that every empire bleeds.